the Christmas party, my millionaire son hugged me and said, "Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom?" I went pale and replied, "Son, I'm working 2 jobs." That's when my greedy daughter-in-law choked on her food. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I'm Doreen, and at 65 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak life could throw at me. I was wrong. Nothing prepared me for what happened at my son's Christmas party last December when my entire world crumbled with just one sentence. The party was everything I'd expected from Boyd and his wife Edna: extravagant, cold, and designed to impress people I'd never met. Their house looked like something out of a magazine, all marble countertops and crystal chandeliers. I stood in the corner of their massive living room, wearing my best dress, a navy blue number I'd bought on clearance 3 years ago, feeling completely out of place among the designer gowns and expensive suits. My feet were killing me. I'd just finished an 8-hour shift at the grocery store where I work as a cashier, and before that, I'd spent the morning cleaning offices downtown. At my age, working 2 jobs wasn't easy, but it was the only way I could make ends meet. My Social Security barely covered my rent, let alone food and medication. Boyd was across the room, looking every inch the successful tech CEO he'd become. Tall, confident, wearing a suit that probably cost more than I made in 2 months. He was laughing with some business associates, gesturing with a crystal glass of what I knew was expensive whiskey. My chest swelled with pride despite everything. He'd worked so hard to get where he was, and I'd sacrificed everything to make sure he could. Edna floated between groups of guests like she owned the world. She'd always been beautiful, blonde, perfectly put together, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. But there was something cold in her green eyes whenever she looked at me, something that made me feel small and unwanted. I was reaching for a small sandwich from the appetizer table when Boyd approached me. He'd had a few drinks, I could tell by the slight flush in his cheeks and the way he moved just a little too confidently. "Mom," he said, wrapping his arm around my shoulders in what looked like an affectionate gesture, but felt somehow calculated. "You're looking good. Really good." "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied, trying to ignore how forced his smile seemed. "This is a lovely party. You and Edna have outdone yourselves." He nodded, but his eyes had that distant look I'd grown accustomed to over the years, like he was performing the role of a good son rather than actually being one. "I'm glad you're here," he continued, and then his voice took on a tone I'd never heard before, casual, almost mocking. "Enjoying those $5,000 a month, Mom? Really living it up, I hope." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face, my knees nearly buckled. $5,000? What was he talking about? "Honey," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the party chatter. "What $5,000? Boyd's expression shifted from casual confidence to confusion. "The money I send you every month. The $5,000 I've been transferring to your account for the past 3 years. I gripped his arm, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Boyd, I'm working 2 jobs. I clean offices at 6 in the morning and work at the grocery store until 8 at night. I haven't received any money from you." The laughter around us seemed to grow louder, more oppressive. Boyd's face went completely white. "That's impossible. I set up automatic transfers. Edna helped me organize everything. She said you were probably too proud to mention it, but that you needed the help." At the mention of her name, we both turned to look at Edna. She was standing near the Christmas tree, a piece of shrimp halfway to her mouth. But she wasn't eating. She was staring at us with the expression of someone who'd just seen a ghost. Our eyes met across the room, and in that instant, I saw the truth. The guilt, the panic, the desperate calculation in her face told me everything I needed to know. The color drained from her carefully made-up complexion, and then she started choking. Not choking on the shrimp, choking on the realization that her secret was out. The piece of seafood fell from her hand as she grabbed her throat, making horrible gasping sounds, but I could see it wasn't the food causing her distress. It was fear, pure, undiluted fear. Boyd rushed to her side, patting her back, asking if she was okay. But Edna's eyes never left mine. In them, I saw 3 years of lies, 3 years of stolen money, 3 years of watching me struggle while she lived in luxury, funded by what should have been my support. The room felt like it was spinning. Guests were starting to notice the commotion. Someone asked if they should call a doctor. But all I could think about was the mortgage payment I'd missed last month, the prescription I couldn't afford to fill, the nights I'd gone to bed hungry because there wasn't enough money for both rent and food. The money, I whispered to Boyd as he continued trying to help his choking wife. Where did you send the money? He looked up at me, his face a mixture of confusion and growing dread. To your account, the one Edna set up for you. She said it would be easier to manage that way, that you were getting older and might have trouble keeping track of finances. Edna had stopped choking, but she was still gasping, still staring at me with those terrified eyes. She knew I knew, and she knew that her perfect little world was about to come crashing down. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just a terrible, crystal-clear understanding of how completely I'd been betrayed by the 2 people who should have protected me most. The party continued around us, but everything had changed. The laughter sounded hollow, the lights seemed dimmer, and I realized that this beautiful house, this lavish lifestyle, this perfect Christmas celebration, it had all been built, at least partially, on money that was meant to keep me from working myself to death at 65. Edna finally caught her breath, straightening her expensive dress and trying to compose herself. But her hands were shaking, and when she looked at me again, I saw something I'd never seen in her eyes before. She was terrified of me. And for the first time in 3 years of struggle and sacrifice, I felt something other than exhaustion and resignation. I felt power. Standing in that opulent living room, watching my daughter-in-law's face flush with guilt and panic, my mind drifted back to a time when Boyd needed me more than anything else in the world. It seems almost cruel how memories work. In your darkest moments, they remind you of everything you've lost. I was 32 when my husband Robert died. A heart attack at 35. No warning, no time to prepare. 1 minute, he was laughing at Boyd's silly 5-year-old jokes over breakfast. The next minute he was gone, leaving me with a kindergartner and a mountain of medical debt that insurance barely touched. Those first months after Robert's death were the hardest of my life. Boyd would wake up crying for his daddy every night, and I'd hold him in our tiny apartment, both of us grieving in our own ways. I remember one particular evening when he looked up at me with those big brown eyes. The same eyes that now looked at me with such distance and asked when Daddy was coming home. "Daddy's not coming home, sweetheart," I'd whispered, my own tears falling onto his small head. "But Mommy's here. Mommy will always be here." And I was. I was there for everything. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. I cleaned offices before dawn, worked at a diner during the day, and took in sewing at night after Boyd went to bed. My fingers were constantly pricked and swollen from the needlework, my back ached from the cleaning, and I lived on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night. But Boyd never knew we were struggling. I made sure of that. When he wanted to join Little League, I sold my wedding ring to pay for the equipment and fees. When he needed new school clothes, I wore the same 3 outfits for 2 years so he could have what the other kids had. When he got sick, I worked double shifts to pay for doctor visits because we didn't have health insurance I could afford. I remember the night Boyd came home from school, excited about a field trip to the Science Museum. The permission slip required a $25 fee. I looked at that piece of paper and felt my heart break. I had $12 to my name and rent was due in 3 days. That night, after Boyd fell asleep, I walked 6 blocks to the pawn shop and sold my mother's necklace, the only piece of jewelry I had left from my family. The pawnbroker gave me $30 for something that was probably worth 10 times that, but I didn't argue. Boyd went on that field trip, and he never knew what it cost me. High school was even harder. Boyd was smart, brilliant actually, but he wanted to take advanced classes that required expensive textbooks and lab fees. He wanted to join the debate team, the computer club, the academic decathlon. Each activity meant more money I didn't have, more sacrifices I gladly made. I took out loans I couldn't afford to buy him a decent computer when he showed an interest in programming. I worked Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve every year for the overtime pay, so he could have the calculator he needed for advanced math, the chemistry set he wanted for his birthday, the clothes that would help him fit in with classmates whose parents had money. The college years nearly killed me. Boyd got into a prestigious university with a partial scholarship, but I still needed to come up with $30,000 a year for room, board, and the expenses the scholarship didn't cover. I took out a second mortgage on our tiny house, the one I'd finally managed to buy after years of renting, and worked every hour I could find. I aged 10 years in those 4 years. My hair went completely gray, my arthritis set in from all the physical labor, and I developed high blood pressure from the constant stress. But every time Boyd called home to tell me about his grades, his internships, his plans for the future, it felt worth it. He graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science and immediately got a job at a tech startup that would eventually make him a millionaire. I was so proud I cried during his graduation ceremony, not just because he'd succeeded, but because all those years of sacrifice had finally paid off. But something changed after graduation. Boyd moved across the country for his job, and our phone calls became less frequent. He was busy, he said. Important meetings, big projects, networking events. I understood he was building his career just like I'd always wanted him to. Then he met Edna. I knew from the moment I met her that she didn't like me. It wasn't anything she said directly. Edna was too sophisticated for that. It was the way she looked at my worn-out clothes, my calloused hands, my small house with its outdated furniture. I could see her calculating my worth and finding me lacking. She started subtly discouraging Boyd from visiting. Suddenly, every time he planned to come see me, there was a work emergency or a social obligation that Edna deemed more important. When I called, she would answer the phone with a cool politeness that made it clear I was interrupting something more significant. "Boyd's in a meeting," she'd say, or, "He's really overwhelmed with work right now, Doreen. Maybe try calling next week." Gradually, the calls stopped coming altogether. Birthday cards became the extent of our communication. Boyd would send expensive gifts, things I couldn't use or afford to maintain, like silk scarves or electronics I didn't understand. But he stopped asking how I was doing or if I needed anything. I told myself it was natural. Sons grow up, move on, start their own families. I'd done my job raising him, and now he was living his own life. The loneliness was just part of being an older woman whose child had become successful. But standing in their mansion, looking at the crystal chandeliers and marble floors, calculating how much their furniture cost compared to my monthly income, I realized something that made my chest tighten with a pain I'd never experienced before. All those years of sacrifice, all those nights I went hungry so he could eat, all the times I worked myself to exhaustion so he could have opportunities. None of it had taught him the value of taking care of family. Edna had convinced him that I was somehow beneath them, that my struggles were my own fault, that helping me was charity rather than love. And while I'd been working 2 jobs at 65, cleaning toilets and standing on my feet for 14 hours a day, they'd been living in luxury, believing I was getting money I never saw. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the realization that the little boy I'd held through nightmares, the teenager I'd sacrificed everything for, the young man I'd been so proud of, had become someone who could forget me so completely. As I watched Edna struggle to regain her composure, still avoiding my eyes, I felt something shift inside me. The grief and confusion were still there, but underneath them was something harder and colder. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about what was best for Boyd. I was thinking about what was best for me. The days following the Christmas party passed in a blur of uncomfortable silence and difficult conversations. Boyd had insisted on driving me home that night, his face pale and drawn as we sat in his expensive car outside my small duplex. He kept apologizing, his voice shaking with confusion and what I hoped was genuine remorse. "Mom, I swear I had no idea," he'd said, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. "I've been sending that money religiously. Every month, $5,000 transferred to the account Edna set up." I'd nodded, too exhausted and emotionally drained to say much. "I believe you, sweetheart, but we need to figure out what happened to it." 3 days later, Boyd called and asked if he could come over. His voice was different, harder, angrier than I'd heard it in years. When he arrived at my door, he looked like he hadn't slept since the party. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and there was something in his eyes that reminded me of the little boy who used to run to me when he was hurt. "We need to talk," he said, settling onto my worn couch with a thick folder of papers. "I've been doing some investigating." I poured us both coffee in my mismatched mugs, the only ones I had left after selling most of my good dishes last year to pay for a car repair. Boyd spread the papers across my coffee table, pointing to bank statements and transfer records with a trembling finger. "Here," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "This is the account I've been sending money to for 3 years. Look at the name on it." I leaned forward, squinting at the small print. The account was indeed in my name, Doreen Elizabeth Crawford, but there was something off about the address. Instead of my duplex on Maple Street, it listed an address I didn't recognize. "That's not my address," I said slowly. "I've never seen this account before in my life." Boyd's jaw clenched. "The address belongs to a mailbox rental place downtown. Edna has been intercepting all the statements. She told me she was helping you manage your finances because you were getting older and might have trouble keeping track of things." The words hit me like a slap. "She said I was getting senile?" "Not in those words, but..." Boyd ran his hands through his hair. "God, Mom, I'm so stupid. She made it sound like she was protecting you. She said you were proud and might be embarrassed about needing help, so it was better if I handled everything through her." I stared at the bank statements, watching the numbers blur as tears filled my eyes. Month after month, $5,000 had been deposited into this fake account. But the withdrawal patterns told a different story entirely. The money wasn't being saved or carefully managed. It was being spent, often within days of each deposit. "What has she been spending it on?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Boyd pulled out another set of papers, credit card statements and receipts he'd apparently gathered from their home. Spa treatments, designer clothes, girls' trips to wine country with her friends, that expensive gym membership she just had to have, the personal trainer, the weekly manicures, the shopping sprees. As he read off the list, I felt a strange detachment settle over me. While I'd been skipping meals to afford my arthritis medication, Edna had been getting $100 facials. While I'd been wearing the same winter coat for 8 years, she'd been buying designer handbags. While I'd been lying awake at night worrying about money, she'd been living off my son's generosity. Generosity that had been meant for me. "There's more," Boyd said quietly, and something in his tone made my stomach clench. I found emails. Correspondence between Edna and her sister, her friends. She's been bragging about it. He handed me printed copies of email exchanges, and as I read them, I felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest. "You should see how easy it is to manage Boyd's guilt about his mother," one email read. "I just mention how she's struggling, and he immediately wants to throw money at the problem. Of course, I make sure the money goes where it's actually needed, maintaining our lifestyle. His mother is surviving fine on her own. She's tougher than he thinks." Another email was even worse. "The old woman actually thinks Boyd doesn't care about her anymore. It's perfect. She's too proud to ask for help directly, and Boyd feels like he's doing his duty by sending money. Meanwhile, I get to enjoy the benefits without having to deal with a needy mother-in-law constantly asking for handouts." But the email that broke my heart was the most recent one, sent just 2 weeks before the Christmas party. "Boyd keeps talking about having his mother over for Christmas. I can't stand the thought of her in my house, judging everything, making Boyd feel guilty about our success. Maybe it's time to phase out the money transfers. She's managed this long without them. She obviously doesn't really need the help." I set the papers down with shaking hands. Boyd was watching me carefully, his face a mixture of rage and guilt and something that might have been fear. "Mom," he said softly, "I am so sorry. I trusted her completely. I thought I was taking care of you." I looked around my small living room, at the furniture I'd bought secondhand 20 years ago, the carpet worn thin from use, the windows that needed replacing, but that I couldn't afford to fix. Then I thought about Edna's mansion, with its marble countertops and crystal chandeliers and rooms bigger than my entire house. "Where is she now?" I asked. "At her sister's. She left right after the party, said she needed time to think. She hasn't been answering my calls." I nodded slowly. Of course she'd run. She knew exactly what she'd done, and she knew she'd been caught. The question was what she planned to do next, try to deny everything, blame me somehow, or attempt to manipulate Boyd into forgiving her. "Boyd," I said carefully, "I need you to understand something. This isn't just about the money." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "She didn't just steal from me. She stole 3 years of your love, your concern, your care. You thought you were helping me, so you didn't worry about whether I was okay. You didn't call because you figured the money was enough. She made sure I felt abandoned by my own son while she enjoyed the benefits of your generosity." Boyd's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the little boy who used to cry in my arms after his father died. "I abandoned you," he whispered. "I let her convince me that sending money was the same as caring." "You didn't know," I said. But even as I spoke the words, I felt the weight of all those lonely years, all those nights I'd wondered why my son never called, never visited, never seemed to care whether I was struggling. "I should have known," Boyd said fiercely. "I should have visited more, called more, paid attention. I should have seen that you were working yourself to death while my wife was living in luxury." We sat in silence for a long moment, both of us processing the magnitude of Edna's betrayal. Finally, Boyd spoke again. "What do you want me to do, Mom? I'll leave her. I'll make sure you get every penny back with interest. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." I looked at my son, really looked at him, for the first time in years. Underneath the expensive clothes and successful exterior, I could see the guilt eating at him, the genuine horror at what his wife had done. But I could also see something else. A man who had become comfortable with the idea that money could solve problems, that financial support was equivalent to emotional care. "I need time to think," I said finally, "about what I want, about what's fair, about what comes next." Boyd nodded, gathering up the papers. "Of course. Take all the time you need. And Mom, I'm going to make this right. I promise." After he left, I sat alone in my small living room, surrounded by the evidence of Edna's deception. But I wasn't thinking about the money anymore, or even about the betrayal. I was thinking about power and how completely I'd given mine away without even realizing it. For the first time in years, I was thinking about what I wanted instead of what everyone else needed from me. And what I wanted was something Edna had never considered possible. I wanted to win. 2 weeks had passed since Boyd's revelation about the fake bank account, and I'd been doing my own investigating. At 65, I might not have understood computers the way my son did, but I understood people, and I understood records. Years of managing household finances on a shoestring budget had taught me to pay attention to details that others might miss. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, surrounded by papers I'd requested from the bank, when my phone rang. Boyd's number flashed on the screen, and something in the urgency of the ring told me this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Mom," his voice was strained, exhausted. "We need to talk. Can I come over?" "Of course, sweetheart." 20 minutes later, Boyd stood at my door looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His face was haggard, his clothes rumpled, and there was a defeated quality to his posture that reminded me of the day his father died. Behind him stood a woman I didn't recognize, middle-aged, professional-looking, carrying a briefcase. "Mom, this is Patricia Williams. She's a forensic accountant. I hired her to dig deeper into Edna's finances." Boyd's voice was flat, emotionless. "What she found. It's worse than we thought." Patricia shook my hand with a firm grip, her expression sympathetic but businesslike. "Mrs. Crawford, may we sit down? What I need to share with you is quite extensive." We settled around my small dining table, and Patricia opened her briefcase, pulling out folders thick with documents. "Mrs. Crawford, when your son first contacted me, I thought we were dealing with a simple case of financial deception, a wife intercepting money intended for her mother-in-law. But this goes much deeper." She spread out bank statements, credit reports, and what looked like legal documents. "Your daughter-in-law didn't just steal the money your son was sending you. She's been systematically manipulating your son's entire financial picture for years." Boyd leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Mom, she's been lying about everything. The house, the cars, the lifestyle. It's all been funded by money she claimed was being spent on various family needs, including money she said was for you." "I don't understand," I said, though a cold dread was beginning to settle in my stomach. Patricia pointed to a series of transactions on one of the statements. "Your son has been incredibly generous over the years, Mrs. Crawford. Not just the $5,000 a month that was supposed to go to you, but additional money for what Edna claimed were your medical emergencies, home repairs, car troubles, crisis after crisis that required immediate financial assistance." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What medical emergencies? What home repairs?" "Exactly," Patricia said grimly. "In the past 3 years alone, Edna claimed you needed $47,000 for various emergencies. A roof replacement after storm damage that supposedly devastated your house. Emergency surgery that your insurance didn't cover. A car accident that left you unable to work for months." Boyd's voice was barely a whisper. "I thought I was helping you through crisis after crisis. Every time I'd start to worry about visiting you or wonder why you never called to thank me, Edna would tell me you were too proud, too embarrassed about needing help. She told me you specifically asked that he not visit during these difficult times," Patricia continued, reading from what appeared to be printed emails. "That you were depressed about your financial situation and didn't want your son to see you struggling." I stared at the papers, trying to process the magnitude of what I was hearing. Not only had Edna stolen the monthly support Boyd thought he was providing, but she'd invented emergencies, created fictional crises, all to extract even more money while ensuring that Boyd stayed away from me. "How much?" I asked quietly. Patricia consulted her notes. "Including the monthly payments and the emergency funds, approximately $230,000 over 3 years. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. $230,000, more money than I'd earned in the last 6 years combined. Money that could have allowed me to retire, to live comfortably, to stop working 2 jobs at an age when I should have been enjoying my golden years. But there's more," Patricia said, and I wasn't sure I could handle any more revelations. "Mrs. Crawford, are you familiar with your late husband's family property? The land his grandfather left him?" I frowned. "You mean the old property upstate? Robert inherited it from his grandfather, but we never did anything with it. It was just wild land, trees, and a creek. After Robert died, I couldn't afford to pay the property taxes, so I assumed it had been sold for taxes years ago." Boyd and Patricia exchanged a look that made my stomach clench. "Mrs. Crawford," Patricia said carefully, "that property was never sold for taxes. Your daughter-in-law has been paying the taxes on it for 3 years. She also commissioned a land survey and an environmental assessment." "Why would she do that?" I asked, though something deep in my gut already knew the answer wouldn't be good. "Because the state is planning a new highway expansion, and that property is directly in the path of development. The government will be forced to purchase it through eminent domain, and the compensation estimate is between $1, $2, and $8 million. The room started to spin. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what I was hearing. "Are you telling me that land is worth over $1 million?" "Yes, ma'am, and legally, as your late husband's widow, you're the rightful owner. But Edna has been positioning herself to claim ownership by virtue of the fact that she's been paying the taxes and maintaining the property." Boyd's face was white as paper. "She's been planning this for years, Mom. The whole time she was stealing from you, making you struggle, keeping me away from you. She was positioning herself to steal your inheritance, too." I thought about all the times I'd wondered what had happened to that old property, all the times I'd felt guilty about letting it go. Robert had loved that land. His grandfather had cleared it by hand, built a small cabin there that had long since fallen down. I'd always meant to visit it, to see if there was anything salvageable, but I'd never had the time or money for such a trip. "She's been going there," Patricia continued. "Maintaining the access road, clearing brush, even having the old foundation surveyed. She's created a paper trail that suggests she's been the property's caretaker for years." "Can she really steal it from me?" I asked. "Not if we act quickly," Patricia said. "But she's been clever about creating documentation that could support a claim of adverse possession. If this had gone on much longer, she might have been able to make a legal case for ownership." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Edna's deception. This wasn't just about stealing money or manipulating my relationship with my son. She had been systematically planning to steal my husband's legacy, the one thing of real value he'd left behind. "There's one more thing," Patricia said, and her voice was even more careful now. "Mrs. Crawford, we found evidence that Edna has been researching your health insurance, your medical history, your life expectancy." Boyd made a sound like he'd been punched. "What kind of research?" "The kind someone does when they're planning for future inheritance issues," Patricia said delicately. The implication hit me like a cold wind. Edna hadn't just been stealing from me and planning to steal my property. She'd been calculating how much longer I might live, planning for what she could claim after I was gone. I looked at my son, this successful man who'd thought he was taking care of his mother while his wife systematically destroyed me. His face was crumpled with grief and rage, and something that looked like horror at his own blindness. "Boyd," I said quietly, "I need you to understand something. This isn't your fault." He started to protest, but I held up my hand. "Your wife is a predator. She identified you as someone with money and a generous heart, and she exploited that. She identified me as someone with assets and few protections, and she exploited that too. This was a long-term plan, executed with incredible patience and cunning." "But I should have seen it," Boyd said, his voice breaking. "I should have visited more, called more, paid attention to what was really happening with you." "Yes," I said simply, "you should have. But that doesn't make you responsible for her crimes." We sat in silence for a moment, all of us processing the enormity of what Edna had done. Finally, Patricia spoke. "Mrs. Crawford, what would you like to do with this information? We have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges, civil recovery, and to secure your legal claim to the property. But these decisions are ultimately yours to make." I looked at the papers spread across my table, evidence of the most comprehensive betrayal I could have imagined. Then I looked at my son, who was watching me with desperate hope and terrible guilt. "I need time to think," I said. "But Patricia, I want you to do whatever is necessary to secure my legal claim to that property immediately. Today, if possible." "Of course." After they left, I walked through my small house, seeing it differently now. This wasn't just my humble home anymore. It was evidence of how successfully I'd been victimized. Every worn piece of furniture, every outdated appliance, every sign of my years of struggle stood as testimony to Edna's cruelty. But I was done being a victim. For the first time in years, I had power, and I intended to use it. 3 days after Patricia's devastating revelations, Boyd called me early in the morning. His voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "Mom, Edna's back. She wants to meet with all of us. She says she can explain everything." I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd learned the scope of my daughter-in-law's betrayal, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. In front of me were the legal documents Patricia had rushed through, official papers confirming my ownership of Robert's family property, along with a preliminary estimate of its value. 1. $6 million. Where does she want to meet? I asked. At the house. Our house. She says it's her home too, and she has a right to discuss this on familiar ground. Of course she did. Even in defeat, Edna wanted the advantage of her territory, surrounded by the luxury she'd purchased with stolen money. But I was done letting other people control the terms of my life. No, I said firmly. If she wants to talk, we meet at Patricia's office, with lawyers present. This isn't a family discussion anymore, Boyd. This is a legal matter. Boyd was quiet for a moment. She's not going to like that. I don't care what she likes. 2 hours later, I sat in Patricia's conference room, wearing my best dress, the same navy blue one I'd worn to the Christmas party, but somehow it felt different on me now, more like armor than apology. Boyd sat beside me, his lawyer on his other side. Across the polished table sat Edna and her attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone. Edna looked terrible. Her usually perfect blonde hair was unkempt. Her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her designer clothes seemed to hang on her like costume pieces on the wrong actor. But when our eyes met across the table, I saw that the calculation was still there, the sense that she was working an angle even now. Doreen, she began, her voice soft and apologetic. I know how this must look, but I need you to understand that everything I did was with the best intentions. Patricia leaned forward slightly, her pen poised over a legal pad. Mrs. Crawford, I should inform you that this conversation is being recorded with everyone's consent, as indicated by the signed agreements. Edna's lawyer nodded curtly. Edna herself seemed to hesitate for just a moment before continuing. I was trying to protect Boyd from feeling guilty, she said, her eyes focused on me with what might have been genuine pleading. You're so independent, so proud. Every time he wanted to help you, you'd refuse. I thought if I managed the financial support discreetly, you could maintain your dignity while still getting the help you needed. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I felt a familiar anger building. Even caught red-handed, she was still trying to manipulate the narrative. And the property taxes? Patricia asked mildly. Were you paying those to protect Mrs. Crawford's dignity as well? Edna's composure slipped slightly. I was protecting a family asset. Boyd is Robert's stepson, and when Doreen passes away, that property would naturally. I'm not Boyd's stepson, Boyd said sharply. Robert adopted me legally when I was 7. That makes me his son, not his stepson. And that property belongs to my mother, not to us. Edna turned to him with the kind of desperate look I'd seen her use before when she needed to regain control. Honey, you're upset, and I understand that. But we need to think practically about the future. Your mother isn't getting any younger, and that property is going to require significant management when the state begins the acquisition process. Management that you were planning to provide? Patricia asked. For a substantial fee, I assume? Edna's lawyer placed a hand on her arm, but she ignored him. I was trying to ensure that Boyd's inheritance would be properly handled. Doreen doesn't understand complex financial transactions. That was when something inside me snapped, not into anger, but into perfect, crystal-clear certainty. Edna, I said quietly, and my voice carried a calm authority that surprised even me. I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. She turned to me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely uncertain. I've spent the last 3 days thinking about everything you've done. The stolen money, the fake emergencies, the lies you told my son to keep him away from me, the way you've been planning to steal my husband's legacy. I paused, letting the words settle in the room. But mostly, I've been thinking about how you made me feel for 3 years, how you made me believe that my own son didn't care about me, how you turned his love and generosity into weapons against both of us. Edna's face was pale, but she was still trying to maintain that manipulative earnestness. Doreen, I never meant for you to feel. You meant exactly that, I interrupted, and my voice was still calm, still controlled. You wanted me to feel abandoned and forgotten. You wanted Boyd to feel like he was doing his duty without having to actually connect with me? You orchestrated our separation because it served your purposes. I stood up, Patricia's documents in my hands. Boyd, I said, turning to my son, you've offered to make this right, to give me back the stolen money, to leave Edna and start over. Boyd nodded eagerly. Yes, Mom, whatever you want. I don't want your money, I said, and I saw the shock on his face. I don't want you to leave your wife for me. I don't want you to upend your life to fix what she broke. Edna's expression shifted to something that might have been hope, but I wasn't finished. I want something else entirely. I want you to make a choice, Boyd. A real choice, based on who you want to be and what kind of life you want to live. I placed the property documents on the table in front of me. I'm going to be a wealthy woman very soon. This property that your wife tried to steal from me is worth more than $1.5 million. I don't need your money anymore, and I don't need your guilt. Boyd's face was a mixture of confusion and hope. What do you need, Mom? I need you to decide whether you want a relationship with me based on love and respect, or whether you want to continue living in a marriage built on lies and manipulation. I looked directly at Edna, whose face had gone completely white. Because here's what's going to happen. I'm going to sell that property and use the money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I'm going to quit both my jobs and move somewhere beautiful, somewhere I can finally rest. I gathered up my purse and stood to leave. And Edna, I'm going to make sure that everyone, your friends, your family, your social circle, knows exactly what kind of person you are. Not through some public campaign, but through careful, truthful conversations with people who matter to you. Edna's lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, but Edna herself looked like she might faint. But I'm not going to press criminal charges, I continued, and I'm not going to sue you for the money you stole. Do you know why? She shook her head mutely. Because the best revenge isn't destroying you. It's succeeding without you. It's living well while you live with the knowledge of what you've done. I turned back to Boyd one last time. Son, if you want a relationship with me, it has to be real. No more money transfers, no more guilt-driven gestures, just genuine care and respect between a mother and son who choose to be in each other's lives. Boyd stood up, his eyes bright with tears. I want that more than anything, Mom. Then you know what you need to do. I walked out of that conference room feeling lighter than I had in years. Behind me, I could hear Edna's voice, high and desperate, trying to convince Boyd that I was being unreasonable, that she could change, that their marriage was worth saving. But I didn't turn around to see what he would choose. For the first time in my adult life, I was walking toward my own future instead of trying to fix someone else's problems. And it felt like freedom. 18 months later, I was sitting on the wraparound porch of my new house in Asheville, North Carolina, watching the morning mist rise from the Blue Ridge Mountains. The house wasn't enormous. I'd learned that happiness doesn't come from square footage, but it was mine, paid for in full with money from Robert's family property. Every morning, I sat in this same spot with my coffee, marveling at the peace that comes from a life lived on your own terms. The state had purchased the property for $7 million, even more than Patricia's initial estimate. After taxes and legal fees, I'd netted enough to buy this house, set up a comfortable retirement fund, and still have money left over for the kind of life I'd never imagined possible. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, a text from Boyd. We'd developed a routine over the past year, communicating regularly, but naturally, without the forced guilt or obligation that had characterized our relationship for so long. Good morning, Mom. Hope you're enjoying the beautiful weather. Sarah and I are driving down this weekend if you're free for dinner. Sarah, Boyd's new girlfriend, a kind woman who worked as a nurse and treated me like a person rather than an obligation. She was nothing like Edna. Warm where Edna had been cold, genuine where Edna had been calculating. The first time Boyd brought her to visit, I'd watched her carefully, looking for signs of the same manipulative charm that had fooled my son before. Instead, I'd found a woman who listened when I talked, who asked about my life with genuine interest, who helped with the dishes, not because she was performing the role of a good daughter-in-law, but because that's who she was. I texted back, "I'd love that. I'll make my famous pot roast." It had taken Boyd 6 months to leave Edna after that meeting in Patricia's office. 6 months of trying to salvage something from a marriage built on lies, of couples therapy sessions where Edna alternated between tearful apologies and angry accusations. I'd stayed out of it completely, focusing on my own life for the first time in decades. When Boyd finally called to tell me he'd filed for divorce, his voice had been exhausted but relieved. "She fought me on everything, Mom. The house, the cars, even tried to claim she deserved part of your property settlement because she'd managed the family finances for years." Edna had gotten nothing in the divorce except what the law required. Half of the assets that were genuinely Boyd's, none of the money she'd stolen from me, and certainly none of my property settlement. Her lawyer had tried to argue that she deserved compensation for the care management she'd provided, but Patricia had dismantled that argument with cold efficiency. The last I'd heard, Edna was living in a small apartment across town, working as a receptionist at a dental office. Not the dramatic downfall some people might have wanted, but a quiet reduction to the kind of ordinary life she'd always disdained. Boyd occasionally mentioned seeing her around town, looking older and harder, but they never spoke. I'd kept my promise about not pressing criminal charges, but I'd also kept my promise about making sure people knew who she really was. Not through any dramatic confrontation or public exposure, but through the kind of careful, truthful conversations that matter in a small community. When her friends asked why Boyd had left her, I simply told them the truth when asked. When people wondered why she'd moved out of the mansion, I explained about the stolen money and forged documents. The truth, it turned out, was more powerful than any revenge I could have planned. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, emerged from her own house next door, waving as she headed to her garden. She was 82, a widow like me, and over the past year she'd become the kind of friend I'd never had time for when I was working 2 jobs and worrying about money. We shared recipes, watched old movies together, and sometimes just sat on our respective porches in comfortable silence. "Morning, Doreen," she called. "Coffee's especially good today, isn't it?" "Perfect weather for it," I called back, and marveled again at how such simple pleasures had become precious to me. I'd quit both my jobs the day the property sale was finalized. Walking out of that grocery store for the last time, hanging up my cashier's vest, had felt like shedding a skin I'd outgrown years ago. The cleaning job had been even easier to leave. I'd simply called the company and told them I was retiring. Retirement. At 66, I was finally doing what most people did in their 60s, enjoying the fruits of a lifetime of work, spending time on hobbies and relationships instead of survival. I'd taken up painting, something I'd always wanted to try, but never had time for. My small studio was set up in what had been intended as a formal dining room, easel positioned to catch the mountain light. I wasn't particularly good at it, but that wasn't the point. The point was having time to be bad at something new, time to improve slowly, time to create something just for the joy of creation. My phone rang, interrupting my peaceful morning thoughts. Patricia's name appeared on the screen. "Good morning, Patricia. Please tell me this isn't about legal problems." Her laugh was warm. "Nothing like that, Doreen. I'm calling with good news. Remember that class action lawsuit against the financial management company that Edna used to hide your money? Of course. They've agreed to settle. The amount isn't huge, about $12,000 for you, but it's something. More importantly, the company has agreed to implement new safeguards to prevent this kind of fraud in the future. $12,000 wouldn't change my life, but knowing that other families might be protected from what I'd experienced felt like a victory of a different sort. "That's wonderful news," I said. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "I've been contacted by a legal aid organization. They're seeing more cases like yours, adult children's spouses manipulating family finances, isolating elderly parents, that sort of thing. They'd like to talk to you about sharing your story, maybe helping develop resources for other families." I considered this carefully. A year ago, the thought of making my private pain public would have terrified me. But now, with the security of financial independence and the clarity that comes from having survived betrayal, it felt like an opportunity to transform my experience into something useful. I'd be interested in hearing more about that, I said. After Patricia hung up, I remained on my porch, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this place. The betrayal that had devastated me had also ultimately freed me. The son I'd thought I'd lost had found his way back to me, not through guilt or obligation, but through genuine choice. The money I'd never known I had given me, not just financial security, but the power to shape my own life. Boyd's car pulled into my driveway, just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. He got out alone. Sarah must have stayed behind to handle some work obligations, and walked toward me with the easy gait of a man who'd shed a significant burden. "Morning, Mom," he said, settling into the chair beside mine. "Sarah sends her apologies. She got called in for an emergency at the hospital but promises to make it up to you next weekend." "She doesn't need to make up anything," I said. "I like that she takes her job seriously." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us looking out at the mountains. Finally, Boyd spoke. "I've been thinking about Dad lately, about what he would have thought of all this." I smiled. "He would have been proud of how you handled it once you understood what was happening. And he would have loved knowing that his grandfather's land finally provided for his family the way the old man always hoped it would." "Do you think he would have seen through Edna sooner than I did?" It was a question Boyd had asked in various forms over the past year, and I understood the guilt that drove it. But I'd also learned something about forgiveness, not the kind you give to others, but the kind you give to yourself. Your father was a good man, but he wasn't magic, sweetheart. Smart people get fooled by manipulative people every day. The important thing is that you figured it out eventually and made the right choice. Boyd nodded, but I could see he was still carrying some of that weight. "Boyd," I said, "I need you to understand something. What happened with Edna wasn't your fault, but more importantly, it wasn't a waste. Those 3 years of separation, of misunderstanding, they taught us both something valuable." He turned to look at me. "They taught us that our relationship can't be based on duty or guilt or obligation. It has to be based on choice. Every conversation we have now, every visit, every text message, it's because we want to be in each other's lives, not because we feel we have to be." Boyd's eyes were bright with tears. "I do want to be in your life, Mom. Not because I feel guilty about the past, but because I genuinely like the person you are. I like sitting here talking with you. I like hearing about your painting classes and your neighbor friends. I like that you're finally living the life you deserve. And I like the man you've become," I said. "Not the successful businessman, though I'm proud of that too. I like the person who was brave enough to leave a marriage that was killing his soul. I like the person who chose honesty over comfort." We sat quietly for a while longer, and I thought about the strange mathematics of loss and gain. I'd lost 3 years of my son's presence, a significant amount of money, and the illusion that family loyalty was automatic. But I'd gained financial independence, genuine peace, and a relationship with Boyd that was deeper and more honest than anything we'd had before. As the morning sun climbed higher over the mountains, I felt the kind of contentment I'd never experienced before. Not the desperate gratitude of someone who'd been given unexpected kindness, but the solid satisfaction of someone who'd fought for what they deserved and won. I was 67 years old, financially secure, surrounded by people who chose to love me rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate me. I had time to paint badly, time to drink coffee slowly, time to watch the seasons change from my own front porch. It had taken me nearly 7 decades to learn that the best revenge against those who try to diminish you isn't destruction or punishment. It's living so well that their betrayal becomes irrelevant. And for the first time in my life, I was doing exactly that. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.